Ronan Prescott wasn't used to feeling pain, at least, not the physical kind. But as he lay on the white sand beach of the private Bahamian island, clutching his leg, he realized that even billionaires weren't immune to bad luck. The jet ski had flipped too fast, the impact sending him crashing into the water. Now, his knee throbbed in a way that told him something was definitely wrong. His security team rushed toward him, but he waved them off, his pride refusing to let them see him weak. "Sir, we need to get you medical attention," one of his staff urged. "Find a private doctor," Ronan gritted out. "I'm not spending my vacation in some public hospital." Within an hour, a woman arrived at his rented villa, carrying a medical bag and an air of quiet confidence. She wasn't what he expected. No stiff white coat, no clinical detachment, just soft brown hair in a loose ponytail, intelligent hazel eyes, and a nurse's uniform that somehow made her look more graceful than professional. "I'm Lainey Kensington," she said, kneeling beside him. "Let's take a look at that leg before you scare your staff half to death." Ronan arched a brow. He wasn't used to people talking to him like that, especially not in a way that wasn't dripping with either fear or reverence. "You're a nurse?" he asked, trying to ignore the way her fingers skimmed over his skin as she examined his knee. "That's what the license says," she quipped. "Lucky for you, I specialize in orthopedic injuries." She was efficient, checking for fractures, pressing gently against the swelling. Ronan clenched his jaw, unwilling to show weakness, but Lainey noticed anyway. "That bad, huh?" she murmured, meeting his gaze. He didn't answer, but something about her eyes made him feel exposed. It was unsettling. "You've torn a ligament," she finally said. "You need rest, ice, and compression. I can stay on the island to monitor you if you want." He should have sent her away. He had an entire team at his disposal, a personal physician back home. But instead, he heard himself saying, "Stay." Lainey blinked, surprised. "All right then." As she wrapped his leg, Ronan found himself watching her. She wasn't flustered by his presence, wasn't fawning over his wealth. In fact, she seemed utterly unimpressed by who he was. It was refreshing. "You do this a lot?" he asked. "Patch up reckless men with too much money and too little common sense," she teased. "More than you'd think." Ronan actually laughed, a rare thing. He hadn't expected to enjoy her company, but there was something about Lainey Kensington that he found intriguing. Maybe this vacation wouldn't be a complete disaster after all. Ronan wasn't used to being idle. His entire life had been built on control of his businesses, his time, and most importantly, himself. Now, confined to a chaise lounge on his private villa's veranda, he hated the helplessness clawing at him. Lainey, however, seemed utterly unbothered by his frustration. She arrived each morning with quiet efficiency, checking his injury, adjusting his brace, and ensuring he stayed off his feet. She didn't hover, didn't treat him like some fragile thing, but she also didn't tolerate his stubbornness. And for reasons he didn't quite understand, he let her boss him around. One afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, she sat across from him, her focus on the medical journal in her lap. The salty breeze lifted strands of her hair, and Ronan found himself watching her instead of the ocean. "You don't seem like the type to take house calls," he mused, breaking the silence. She glanced up, unimpressed by the observation. "You don't seem like the type to follow doctor's orders." He huffed out a quiet laugh. "And yet here we are." She closed her journal, setting it aside. "I don't usually do private care. I work at a clinic in Miami, but one of my colleagues got the call and I happened to be available." "Convenient," he murmured, studying her. She met his gaze without hesitation. "For you, maybe. For me, it's just another patient." He wasn't sure why that irritated him. People usually cared whether it was about his wealth, his reputation, or what he could do for them. But Lainey, she treated him like any other man with an injury, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "You always like making men feel replaceable?" he asked, half joking. She tilted her head, considering him. "You always need to feel important." That made him pause. He wasn't sure anyone had ever said something so direct to him before. He was Ronan Prescott. His presence alone commanded attention. Yet with Lainey, none of that seemed to matter. He leaned back, stretching his injured leg carefully. "I run an empire. Being important is part of the job." Sounds exhausting, he chuckled. It is. For a moment, silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, something he wasn't used to. You're different, he said finally. She arched a brow. Because I don't fall all over myself trying to impress you? Exactly. A small smile tugged at her lips, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stood, gathering her things. You should rest. I'll check on you in the morning. He watched her go, realizing he was looking forward to tomorrow more than he had in a long time. Ronan had never been more aware of time. The days on the island had passed in a slow, unhurried way so different from his usual life of urgent meetings and relentless schedules. But now, with Lainey's presence woven into each morning and evening, time felt like something he wanted to grip tightly, refusing to let it slip through his fingers. She had become more than just his nurse. Without meaning to, she had settled into his space in a way that felt entirely natural. She moved through the villa like she belonged there, not as a guest, not as an employee, but as someone who fit in a way he couldn't explain. One evening, she brought him outside, away from the veranda where he usually lounged. The sand was cool beneath his bare feet, the tide whispering against the shore. He leaned on the cane she had insisted he use, grumbling about it under his breath as she walked beside him. You act like I asked you to run a marathon, she teased. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his weight. I don't like being dependent on anything. She glanced at him, something unreadable in her expression. Healing isn't dependence, it's patience. He scoffed. Patience isn't a trait I possess. She didn't argue, just smiled faintly before turning her gaze toward the horizon. The sky was painted in streaks of gold and violet, the last remnants of daylight clinging stubbornly to the clouds. You ever think about stopping? She asked after a long moment. He frowned. Stopping what? The empire, the constant movement, the need to always be 3 steps ahead. The question was foreign to him. He had spent his entire life building, achieving, pushing forward. The idea of stopping had never even crossed his mind. But now, watching her toes sink into the sand, the salty breeze lifting the loose strands of hair from her shoulders, he wondered. I don't know how, he admitted. She turned to face him fully. You could learn. He didn't answer because for the first time in years he wasn't sure what his answer should be. They stood there for a while, the ocean stretching endlessly before them, the quiet between them comfortable. It was Lainey who finally broke it, nudging him gently toward the villa. Come on, billionaire, let's get you back before you make your injury worse and I have to stay here even longer. He followed her, but the thought that struck him hardest wasn't about his injury. It was the realization that he didn't mind the idea of her staying longer. In fact, he wanted it, and that scared him more than anything. Ronan had never fought so hard against something he wanted so badly. Every instinct told him to pull Lainey closer, to find a reason, any reason to make her stay. But he knew better. His life didn't allow for hesitation, for softness, for things that weren't planned and controlled. And yet, when he looked at her, standing in the moonlight on that quiet beach, he felt something unravel inside him, something he had spent years keeping locked away. She was leaving soon. The thought gnawed at him. Her job here was nearly done, and once his injury was stable enough, she would go back to Miami, back to a life that didn't involve him. That idea was unbearable. The next morning, he watched her move around the villa, methodically gathering supplies, checking his brace, making notes in the small leather journal she carried. She had always been efficient, but now there was something different in her movements, a quiet finality that made his chest tighten. I'll be heading back in a few days, she said, not looking up from her notes. He had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud sent a sharp, unwelcome ache through him. He should let her go, make some detached comment, thank her for her time, and move on like he always did. But nothing about Lainey felt like something he could move on from. You don't have to, he said, his voice lower than he intended. She stilled, her pen hovering over the page. Ronan, I'll make it worth your while. Double whatever you make at the clinic, triple it if you want, he said, watching for her reaction. She finally looked up, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't what he expected. It wasn't excitement or curiosity, it was disappointment. You think that's why I'm here? She asked quietly. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I don't know how else to make you stay. Her expression softened, but she shook her head. You don't, that's the point of this, isn't it? This was never meant to last. The words hit harder than they should have. He had spent his entire life making sure nothing had the power to shake him, but Lainey had done it effortlessly, without even trying, and now she was walking away. That night he couldn't sleep. He stood by the open balcony doors, staring out at the water, the sound of the waves filling the silence. He should have been thinking about his return to the world that waited for him, the meetings, the acquisitions, the responsibilities stacked neatly in his absence. But all he could think about was her, how she had made the days feel different, how her presence had eased something inside him he hadn't even realized had been tight for years. By the time the sun began to rise, he knew what he had to do. The morning came too fast. She was already packing when he found her, her suitcase sitting open on the chair, half filled with neatly folded clothes. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in 3 strides, caught her wrist gently, and turned her toward him. "Don't go," he said, his voice rough. She searched his face, her expression unreadable. "Ronan, I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to ask you to stay without making it sound like a business deal, but I know I don't want you to walk away." Her breath hitched, and for the first time since he met her, she looked unsure. "I wasn't supposed to get attached," she whispered. "Neither was I." He reached up, brushing his fingers along her jaw, tilting her face toward his. "Stay," he murmured. "Not because I'm offering you money. Not because I'm injured. Stay because you want to." She closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, something in them had changed. "Okay," she whispered. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And for the first time in his life, Ronan Prescott felt like he had finally won something that truly mattered. The change between them was subtle but undeniable. Lainey had agreed to stay, yet Ronan felt the weight of what that truly meant. This wasn't just about extending her time on the island. This was about stepping into something uncertain, something neither of them had planned for. For the first time in his life, Ronan Prescott wasn't calculating his next move. He wasn't thinking 10 steps ahead or planning how to control the outcome. He was simply here with her, taking each moment as it came. The first morning after their conversation, Lainey moved through the villa with the same quiet efficiency, but there was a shift in the air between them. When she checked his knee, her fingers lingered just a fraction longer. When she spoke, her voice carried something softer, less guarded. It wasn't just him who had let something slip past his walls. She had too. Later that day, she found him on the terrace, stretching his injured leg carefully. She watched for a moment before stepping beside him, arms crossed. "You're healing faster than you should," she observed. He glanced up, catching the knowing look in her eyes. "Are you accusing me of trying to recover too quickly?" "I'm accusing you of being impatient," she corrected. "And reckless," he exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "I can't sit still forever." "You don't have to," she said simply, "but you don't have to rush back to the world you left behind either." Her words sat heavy between them. He had spent so much time thinking about what would happen when this ended, but for once, he allowed himself to consider what it would mean if it didn't. That night, he surprised her. She had spent the day tending to him, ensuring he didn't push himself too hard, yet she hadn't done anything for herself. So when she returned to her room, she found a dress laid out on the bed, a rich sapphire blue that shimmered under the light. There was a note beside it, written in bold, precise handwriting. "Wear this, meet me outside." She hesitated, pressing the fabric between her fingers. When she finally stepped outside, the sight before her stole her breath. The villa's terrace had been transformed. A private dinner had been set beneath the open sky, lanterns casting a golden glow over the table. The ocean stretched endlessly behind them, waves lapping at the shore in a rhythmic, steady hum. Ronan was already waiting, leaning against his cane, watching her with an intensity that sent warmth curling through her chest. "You did all this?" she asked, taking in the scene. He nodded. "You've spent all this time taking care of me." "I thought it was time I did something for you." She stepped closer, meeting his gaze. "You didn't have to. I wanted to." The night unfolded in a way neither of them expected. They talked not about his injury, not about when they would leave the island, but about things that had nothing to do with the lives they had built before this. She told him about her childhood in a small town, about how she had always wanted to see the world but found herself rooted in the need to help others instead. He told her about the moments before he became the man everyone knew, the times when he had been just a boy with too many expectations placed on his shoulders. It was the first time in years that Ronan Prescott sat across from someone and felt truly seen. As the night stretched on, he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it held more weight than any grand declaration. She didn't pull away. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. Something had changed between them. And neither of them was willing to pretend it hadn't. The days that followed felt like something out of a dream, a reality neither Ronan nor Lainey had expected, but one that neither could deny. The island, once just a temporary escape, had become something more, a place where time slowed, where expectations fell away, where they were simply two people discovering something neither had planned for. Ronan's injury was nearly healed, and with that, a decision loomed in the background. He would have to return to his life soon, back to a world of ruthless business dealings, high-powered negotiations, and a schedule that never allowed for hesitation. And Lainey. She belonged to a different world entirely. That thought gnawed at him, though he kept it buried. For now, he focused on the way she moved through the villa as if she had always been there. The way her laughter had become a sound he craved. The way she looked at him like he was more than just a name, more than a bank account, more than the reputation that had followed him for years. They spent evenings on the terrace, watching the waves roll in under the moonlight. They walked along the shoreline, her teasing him about his stubborn refusal to rely on the cane, even as she kept a careful eye on his movements. And at night, when the world was quiet, he found himself thinking of her in ways he never had with anyone else. One evening, as they sat beneath the stars, she pulled her knees to her chest, gazing at the endless stretch of dark water. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked softly. Ronan exhaled, tilting his head to study her. "Depends on what you mean by next," he said. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You know what I mean," he did, but saying it out loud made it real. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his thighs. "I know I don't want this to end." Her lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across her features before something else took its place, something tender, something hesitant. "I don't either," she admitted. The weight of those words settled between them. Ronan had never been a man who hesitated. He saw what he wanted and took it, built it, made it his. But this, what he felt for Lainey, wasn't something he could force into place. It had to be chosen, so he did something he never did. He took a risk. The next morning, he made a call. Arrangements were made, details finalized, and by the time the sun set, everything was in place. Lainey had no idea what was coming. She found him waiting near the villa's entrance, dressed in something far more formal than the usual linen shirts and effortless luxury he had worn on the island. The sharp lines of his suit contrasted with the relaxed atmosphere, a reminder of the world he had come from and the one he was about to invite her into. She approached slowly, eyes scanning him with curiosity. "What's with the suit?" she asked. He extended a hand toward her. "Come with me." She hesitated for only a moment before slipping her fingers into his. He led her down a pathway she hadn't taken before, toward a secluded part of the island, where a candlelit table had been set beneath a canopy of soft, flowing fabric. The sound of the ocean surrounded them, waves crashing in the distance, the scent of salt and jasmine lingering in the air. Lainey inhaled sharply, her gaze sweeping over the scene. "You did this," she whispered. Ronan nodded, his grip tightening around her hand. "I don't do things halfway," he said. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "No, you don't." He pulled out a chair for her, and as she sat, he took the seat across from her. The dinner was perfect, but Ronan barely tasted the food. His focus was entirely on her, the way her eyes lit up with every new surprise, the way she reached for his hand across the table without hesitation. And then, as the final course was cleared away, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Lainey's breath caught. He opened it, revealing a stunning ring, a delicate but undeniable piece, a reflection of everything he felt but had yet to say. Ronan wasn't a man who begged. He wasn't a man who asked for things he wasn't sure he could have, but for her, he would do anything. "I don't want this to be temporary," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I don't want to go back to my life and pretend this didn't happen. I don't want to be without you." Lainey's eyes shimmered, emotion flickering across her face. "This isn't exactly how I thought my life would go," she admitted. "Neither did I," he said, "but I know what I want, and what I want is you." She exhaled shakily then, without hesitation, reached out and took the ring from the box. "Yes," she whispered. Ronan felt something inside him settle, a quiet certainty that, for the first time, he had made the right choice. The island had brought them together. But this was just the beginning. 1 year later, the world looked entirely different. The ceremony was held on the very same beach where they had fallen in love, the sky painted in warm hues as the sun dipped below the horizon. Lainey stood before him, breathtaking in a gown that moved like water, her eyes filled with the same fire that had drawn him to her from the very beginning. Ronan took her hands in his, a rare, unguarded smile touching his lips. "You changed everything," he murmured. She squeezed his fingers. "So did you?" As they exchanged vows, as they promised forever beneath the open sky, Ronan knew without a doubt this was the most important deal he had ever made. And for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was meant to be.